The champagne had barely gone flat from my wedding reception when I opened an email that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. 24 hours earlier, I'd walked down the aisle with tears in my eyes, watching my father beam with pride from the front row. Now I was staring at DNA test results that proved he wasn't my biological father at all. But here's the thing that still gives me chills. The man who actually was my biological father had been sitting 3 rows behind him the entire time. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Growing up in suburban Phoenix, I always felt like something didn't quite add up in my family. My dad, Robert Chen, was this brilliant software engineer with jet black hair and dark eyes, while my mom, Patricia, had auburn curls and green eyes. Then there was me, blonde hair, blue eyes, and about 6 inches taller than either of them by the time I hit 16. When people asked if I was adopted, my parents would laugh it off, saying I got my looks from my mom's side of the family. My childhood was pretty normal, I guess. Dad worked long hours at a tech company downtown, Mom taught elementary school, and I spent most afternoons at my best friend Madison's house. The Kowalskis lived 2 streets over, in our cookie-cutter neighborhood, and Mrs. Kowalski always had fresh cookies cooling on the counter when we got home from school. Mr. Kowalski worked construction and had this booming laugh that you could hear from their backyard clear across the street. What I remember most about those years was how different the 2 families felt. At home, everything was quiet and structured. Dad would come home, eat dinner while reading technical journals, and disappear into his home office until bedtime. Mom would grade papers at the kitchen table, occasionally asking about my day, but never really pressing for details. We weren't unhappy, exactly, but there wasn't much warmth either. At the Kowalskis, everything was loud and chaotic and alive. Mr. Kowalski would ruffle my hair and ask about school projects, actually listening to my answers. He'd help Madison and me with math homework at their kitchen table, cracking jokes that made us laugh until our stomachs hurt. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me with this strange expression I couldn't quite read, but it never felt uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like he actually saw me in a way my own father never quite did. The summer I turned 15, something shifted. Dad started working even longer hours, sometimes not coming home until after I'd gone to bed. Mom grew distant too, throwing herself into summer school planning and volunteer work at church. I spent more time than ever at Madison's house, where Mr. Kowalski had started teaching me how to change oil in their garage and showing me basic carpentry skills in his workshop. "You're good with your hands, Emma," he told me one afternoon as I successfully installed a cabinet hinge on my 3rd try. "Takes patience and attention to detail. Not everyone has that." I glowed under his praise in a way I never did with my own father. When Dad looked at my report cards, he'd nod approvingly at the A's and point out where I could improve. When Mr. Kowalski saw my art projects or heard about my soccer goals, his face would light up like I'd just solved world hunger. That fall, Mom and Dad started going to marriage counseling. They tried to hide it, but I overheard enough phone calls to piece it together. They'd have these intense, whispered conversations that would stop the moment I walked into a room. The house felt like it was holding its breath all the time. One evening in October, I came home from soccer practice to find Mom crying at the kitchen table. Dad's car wasn't in the driveway. "What's wrong?" I asked, dropping my gear bag by the door. She looked up, hastily wiping her eyes. "Nothing, sweetheart, just work stress." But it wasn't work stress. Over the next few weeks, I watched my parents navigate around each other like strangers sharing a hotel room. They were polite but careful, like they were afraid of saying the wrong thing and triggering some kind of explosion. Christmas that year was particularly awkward. We went through all the motions, tree, presents, traditional ham dinner, but everything felt forced. I escaped to Madison's house as soon as I could, where the Kowalskis were having their usual loud, messy celebration with cousins and neighbors packed into every corner of their living room. "How's everything at home, kiddo?" Mr. Kowalski asked when he found me helping with dishes in the kitchen. I shrugged. "Fine, I guess. Just weird lately." He was quiet for a moment, drying the same plate twice. "You know you can always come here if you need space, right? Our door's always open for you."
There was something in his voice that made me look up at him. He was watching me with that same unreadable expression I'd noticed before, but this time it felt heavier somehow. "Thanks, Mr. K," I said. "I really appreciate that." The tension at home continued through my junior year of high school. Mom and Dad seemed to reach some kind of détente where they could function as roommates, but not much more. They showed up to my soccer games and parent-teacher conferences together, putting on a united front, but I could feel the careful distance they maintained even when sitting next to each other. Meanwhile, my friendship with Madison deepened, which meant spending even more time with her family. Mr. Kowalski started taking me along on weekend projects, fixing Mrs. Patterson's fence, helping the elderly couple down the street with their yard work. He'd tell stories about his own childhood, growing up in a big Polish family in Chicago, and ask thoughtful questions about my plans for college and what I wanted to do with my life. The line went dead. The address on the business card led me to a strip mall on the outskirts of Scottsdale. The unit listed was sandwiched between a check-cashing place and a discount tire shop. No signage indicating any pet-related business. Through the grimy windows, I could see the space appeared empty except for a few folding chairs and a card table. I was starting to piece together that Premium Pet Relocations might not be the legitimate business it claimed to be. Monday morning, I confronted my mother again. I called Premium Pet Relocations. Mom's coffee mug froze halfway to her lips. "You did what?" "The business card was in your room. How much did they pay you for Charlie?" The silence stretched between us for several seconds. Finally, Mom set down her coffee and looked directly at me for the first time since Charlie disappeared. $400. The number hit me like a physical blow. $400. Less than the cost of his dental work. Less than what Dad had originally paid for Charlie as a puppy. "Mom, how could you?" "Don't you dare judge me, Jessica." Her voice turned sharp. "You have no idea what it's like trying to keep this house, put food on the table, pay for your school clothes, your phone bill, everything you take for granted. $400 bought us groceries for a month." "But Charlie wasn't just property. He was family." "The family doesn't pay the electric bill." I wanted to argue, to scream, to demand she tell me exactly where Charlie had gone. But looking at my mother's face, the dark circles under her eyes, the stress lines that seemed to have deepened since Dad left, I realized she wasn't the villain in this story. She was desperate. That didn't make what happened next any easier to accept. Tuesday evening, exactly 1 week after Charlie disappeared, our doorbell rang. I was in my room doing homework when I heard Mom answer the door, followed by the sound of serious, official voices. "Ma'am, we're with the Phoenix Police Department. We need to ask you some questions about a business called Premium Pet Relocations." My blood turned to ice. I crept to my bedroom door and pressed my ear against it, straining to hear the conversation downstairs. "We have reason to believe you may have had dealings with this organization. We're investigating reports of illegal animal trafficking, and your name appeared in some documentation we recovered." "I don't understand." Mom's voice was barely above a whisper. "I just found my daughter's dog a new home." "Ma'am, Premium Pet Relocations is not a legitimate pet adoption service. We have evidence suggesting they've been involved in dogfighting operations, selling animals to unlicensed research facilities, and other illegal activities." The room started spinning. Charlie, gentle, loving Charlie, who was afraid of thunderstorms and liked to steal socks from the laundry basket, had been sold to criminals. "Where is your daughter's dog now?" one of the officers asked. "They said Oregon, a family with a big yard." "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come down to the station and provide a full statement, and we're going to need every detail you can remember about your transaction with Premium Pet Relocations." I waited until I heard the front door close and Mom's car pull out of the driveway before I came downstairs. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and called my best friend Taylor. "They think Charlie was sold to dog fighters," I said without preamble when she answered. "What? Jess, slow down. What are you talking about?" I filled her in on everything: the police visit, Premium Pet Relocations, the empty storefront in Scottsdale. By the time I finished, Taylor was silent for a long moment. "We have to find him," she finally said. "There has to be a way. The police are handling it now. The police have bigger cases than one missing dog. We need to do this ourselves." Taylor picked me up 20 minutes later. Her older brother Marcus was in the passenger seat, a senior who'd always scared me a little with his intense dark eyes and tendency to speak in clipped, serious sentences. Today, though, I was glad for his presence. Marcus knows about underground stuff, Taylor explained as we drove back toward Scottsdale. His friend got involved with some bad people last year. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Thanks for everything, Mr. K, I said, suddenly feeling emotional. I know you're not technically family, but you've always felt like it to me. His eyes got a little watery, and he cleared his throat. You've always felt like family to us too, Emma. Always. The next morning dawned clear and perfect, with that crisp October light that makes everything look like a postcard. I woke up in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by my bridesmaids, feeling nervous and excited and ready to start this new chapter of my life. As I got ready, I kept thinking about how surreal it felt to be getting married in the same city where I'd grown up, with all these people who'd watched me become who I was. Dad knocked on my door right before we left for the hotel, looking handsome in his charcoal gray suit. "Ready, sweetheart?" he asked, offering me his arm. "Ready," I said, and meant it. The ceremony itself was everything I dreamed of. Walking down that garden path with Dad, seeing Jake's face light up when he spotted me, hearing the string quartet play our song, it all felt perfect and timeless and exactly right. The October sun filtered through the trees just enough to keep us warm without being overwhelming, and I remember thinking that if I could freeze any moment in time, it would be this one. Dad squeezed my hand before placing it in Jake's, and for a second, I saw something in his eyes that looked almost like relief. At the time, I thought it was just the emotion of giving away his daughter. Later, I would wonder if it was something else entirely. The vows went smoothly, though Jake got a little choked up during his and had to pause to collect himself. When Pastor Williams pronounced us husband and wife, the applause felt like it came from everywhere at once. I spotted the Kowalskis in the third row, Mrs. Kowalski dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, while Mr. Kowalski clapped so enthusiastically that Madison had to grab his arm to calm him down. During the cocktail hour, I floated from group to group in a happy haze, accepting congratulations and trying to memorize every detail. Jake's college roommate Marcus was telling embarrassing stories about their freshman dorm to anyone who would listen. My work colleagues from the architecture firm were admiring the venue's restored ironwork with the kind of professional appreciation that made me feel proud of my career choice. But it was watching the different parts of my life interact that really made the day special. I caught Dad having what looked like a surprisingly animated conversation with Jake's father about irrigation systems. Mom was helping Mrs. Kowalski track down the photographer for some candid shots of the extended families. Even my normally shy cousin Rebecca seemed to be enjoying herself, laughing at something one of Jake's fraternity brothers was telling her. The reception moved into the hotel's grand ballroom as the sun started to set. We decorated with warm amber lighting and centerpieces of succulents and desert wildflowers that I'd designed myself. The space felt magical, like something out of a fairy tale, but grounded in the Arizona landscape I'd grown up loving. Dinner was a blur of toasts and laughter and trying to eat between conversations. Jake's best man delivered a speech that managed to be both hilarious and touching, complete with a slideshow of photos that somehow made Jake look dignified despite documenting some truly questionable fashion choices from his college years. My maid of honor Madison gave a speech that made me cry happy tears, talking about our friendship and how she'd watched me grow into the person I was meant to be. Then it was Dad's turn. He stood up slowly, tapping his champagne glass with a fork, and the room gradually quieted down. I felt that familiar flutter of anxiety I always got when Dad was about to speak in public. He wasn't naturally comfortable with emotional displays, and I worried he might say something awkward or overly formal. "Emma," he started, then stopped, looking down at his notes. The pause stretched long enough that I started to worry something was wrong. When he looked back up, his eyes were brighter than usual. "Emma has always been," he said finally,
From the day she came into our lives, she brought joy and energy and perspective that Patricia and I never knew we were missing. Watching her grow into the accomplished, caring woman she is today has been the greatest privilege of my life. He paused again, glancing toward where Mr. Kowalski was sitting. Something passed between them, a look I couldn't interpret, but that felt significant somehow. "Jake, you're getting someone special," Dad continued, his voice stronger now. "Someone who sees the world differently than most people, who finds creative solutions to impossible problems, and who has enough warmth and love to make everyone around her feel like family. Take care of her." The applause was warm and genuine, and I felt a surge of love for my quiet, careful father who had just managed to say exactly the right thing despite his discomfort with public speaking. Jake squeezed my hand under the table, and I blinked back tears that would definitely ruin my makeup. After dinner came the dancing. Our first dance was to At Last by Etta James, and I felt like we were floating in our own little bubble while everyone watched. The father-daughter dance with Dad was sweet but slightly stilted. We'd never been natural dancers together, and I could tell he was concentrating hard on not stepping on my dress.
But then Mr. Kowalski appeared at my elbow as the song ended. "Mind if I cut in for the next one?" he asked with that familiar grin. "I'd be honored," I said, and meant it. Dancing with Mr. Kowalski felt completely different. He was confident and smooth, spinning me around the dance floor like we'd done this 100 times before. Other couples joined us, but I felt like we had our own spotlight. "You did good, kiddo," he said as he twirled me under his arm. "This whole day, the way you've handled everything, I'm so proud of you." "Thank you," I said, feeling that familiar warmth that came from his approval. "For everything, not just today, but everything." He pulled me back into the standard dance position, and for a moment his expression grew serious. "You know you'll always be special to our family, right? No matter what happens, no matter where life takes you, you'll always have a place with us." It was a strange thing to say at a wedding, I thought later, almost like he was preparing me for something. But in the moment, it just felt like the kind of thing Mr. Kowalski would say, earnest and a little sentimental in the way that made him such a good honorary father figure. The rest of the evening flew by in a whirlwind of cake cutting, bouquet tossing, and increasingly adventurous dance moves as the open bar took effect. By the time we were ready to make our grand exit through a tunnel of sparklers, I was exhausted but euphoric. Jake and I climbed into the vintage convertible we'd rented for the getaway, waving goodbye to everyone gathered outside the hotel entrance. As we drove away, I turned back to wave one more time and caught sight of the crowd still celebrating on the front steps. Mom and Dad stood together, not touching, but close, watching us leave with expressions I couldn't quite read. The Kowalskis were right beside them, Mrs. Kowalski still waving enthusiastically, while Mr. Kowalski had his hands in his pockets, that thoughtful look on his face again. We spent our wedding night at a boutique resort in Sedona, planning to fly out to Italy for our honeymoon the following evening. I'd been so focused on wedding planning for months that the idea of 2 weeks with nothing to do but explore Tuscany with my new husband felt like the ultimate luxury. Sunday morning, we slept in late and then had room service breakfast on our private balcony, surrounded by the red rock formations that made Sedona feel like another planet. Jake was reading the newspaper while I scrolled through the hundreds of photos that our wedding guests had already started posting on social media. "Look at this one," I said, showing him a candid shot of us during the ceremony. I didn't even know anyone was taking pictures from that angle. My phone buzzed with an email notification, and I almost ignored it. I was trying to stay off work email during the honeymoon. But the sender's name caught my eye. GeneTech DNA Services. "Oh, the DNA results are in," I said, clicking on the email. "This should be fun. Maybe we'll find out I'm descended from Spanish conquistadors or something." Jake laughed, buttering another piece of toast. "Or maybe you'll discover you're related to some famous architect, and it'll all make perfect sense." I was only half listening as I logged into the GeneTech portal and navigated to the results page. At first, the charts and percentages looked exactly like what I'd expected, a mix of European ancestry with some surprises thrown in.
The Irish and German heritage made sense, given what I knew about Mom's side of the family. The small percentage of Scandinavian DNA was interesting, but not shocking. But then I scrolled down to the family matching section, and my stomach dropped. According to the test results, Robert Chen was not my biological father. The confidence level was 99.97%. There was no ambiguity, no margins for error. The man who had raised me, who had walked me down the aisle less than 36 hours ago, shared no genetic material with me whatsoever. "Jake," I said, my voice coming out strange and high. "Jake, look at this." He glanced over from his newspaper, saw my face, and immediately set everything aside. "What's wrong?" I turned my phone toward him, pointing at the screen with a shaking finger. It says Dad isn't my biological father." Jake took the phone, studying the results with the same careful attention he brought to his engineering projects. I watched his expression change as he processed what he was seeing. "Are you sure you're reading this right?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew I was. "I've been staring at it for 5 minutes," I said. "There's no mistake." We sat in silence for a moment, the beautiful Sedona landscape suddenly feeling irrelevant and distant. My mind was racing, trying to process what this meant, what it changed, how it was even possible. "Maybe there was a mix-up at the lab," Jake suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. These things aren't always accurate, right? But even as he said it, I was scrolling through more of the results, and what I found next made everything infinitely more complicated. The system had identified a potential biological father match within their database, someone else who had taken a gene tech test and whose DNA showed a 99.99% probability of being my father. The name at the top of the match report made my hands start shaking so violently that I almost dropped the phone. Thomas Edward Kowalski. Mr. Kowalski had been my biological father all along. I stared at the name on my phone screen until the letters stopped making sense. Thomas Edward Kowalski. The man who had taught me how to change a tire, who had celebrated my college acceptance like it was his own achievement, who had danced with me at my wedding reception just hours ago. He was my biological father. "This can't be right," I whispered, though even as I said it, puzzle pieces were clicking together in my mind with sickening clarity. Jake moved closer on the bed, reading over my shoulder. "Emma, are you okay? You look like you're going to pass out." I wasn't okay. My entire world had just tilted sideways, and I was struggling to find my footing. The red rocks of Sedona that had looked so majestic an hour ago now felt like they were closing in on me. "I need to call someone," I said, though I had no idea who. Mom? Dad? Mr. Kowalski himself? The idea of having any of those conversations made my chest tight with panic. "Maybe we should slow down," Jake said carefully. "These DNA tests aren't always completely accurate, and even if they are, there could be explanations that don't mean what you think they mean." But I was already doing math in my head. I was born in March 1989. If I counted back 9 months, that put my conception around June 1988. I tried to remember what Mom had told me about that time period, but realized she'd always been vague about the details of their early marriage and my birth. "Jake, what if this is why my parents went to marriage counseling when I was 15? I said, the words tumbling out faster than I could think them through. "What if Dad found out somehow, and that's what almost broke them up?" "That's a lot of assumptions based on a computer algorithm," Jake said, but his voice was gentle. "Let's not jump to conclusions until we know more." I appreciated that he was trying to be rational, but my mind was already spinning through 26 years of memories, recontextualizing everything through this new lens. The way Mr. Kowalski had always seemed to see me more clearly than my own father. The strange looks that would pass between him and Dad sometimes. The way Mom had grown distant during my teenage years, especially around the time I was spending so much time at the Kowalskis' house. And then there was the physical resemblance I'd never noticed before. Mr. Kowalski was tall like me, with the same blue eyes and similar bone structure. Madison had always joked that I could pass for her sister more easily than she could pass for her own dark-haired, brown-eyed parents. Now I understand why. I have to go home, I said suddenly, standing up from the bed. I have to talk to them. All of them. Emma, wait, Jake said, catching my hand. We're supposed to fly to Italy tonight, our honeymoon. How can I go to Italy when my entire life just got turned upside down? I asked, pulling away from him. How can I sit on beaches and tour museums when I don't even know who I am anymore? Jake looked hurt, and I immediately felt guilty. This was supposed to be our special time together, the beginning of our marriage, and I was about to derail it because of something that had happened decades before either of us was born. I'm sorry, I said, sitting back down and taking his hands. I know this isn't fair to you, but I can't just pretend I didn't see this. I can't act normal when nothing feels normal anymore. He squeezed my hands, studying my face. What do you need? The question was so simple and caring that I almost started crying. I need to understand what happened. I need to know if the people who raised me have been lying to me my whole life. And I need to figure out what this means for everything. We spent the next 2 hours canceling flights and rearranging plans. The airline wasn't thrilled about our last-minute change, and the hotel in Florence was less than understanding about our cancellation. But Jake handled all of it without complaint. He booked us a room back in Phoenix for that night and promised we'd reschedule the honeymoon once I had some answers. The drive back to Phoenix felt endless. I kept picking up my phone to call someone, then putting it back down because I had no idea how to start any of those conversations. How do you ask your mother if she had an affair 27 years ago? How do you confront the man who raised you with evidence that he's not your biological father? How do you approach your neighbor with DNA results suggesting he's been keeping a massive secret your entire life? By the time we got back to the city, I decided to start with Mom. If anyone was going to give me straight answers, it would be her. And she deserved to know what I'd discovered before I started confronting anyone else. We drove to my parents' house in the early evening. Dad's car was in the driveway, but I asked Jake to wait in our car while I went inside. I wasn't ready to face both of my parents at once.
I found Mom in the kitchen, cleaning up what looked like the remnants of a quiet Sunday dinner. She looked up when I walked in, immediately noticing something was wrong. "Emma, what are you doing here? Aren't you supposed to be on your way to Italy?" "We need to talk," I said, sitting down at the kitchen table where I'd done homework for 12 years, about the DNA test. Her face went very still. "The results came back already?" "This morning." I pulled out my phone and set it on the table between us. "Mom, the test says Dad isn't my biological father." The silence stretched so long that I started to wonder if she'd heard me. She stood frozen by the sink, a dish towel in her hands, staring at the phone like it was a bomb that might explode. "Mom?" She sat down across from me, setting the towel aside carefully. When she finally looked up, her eyes were already filled with tears. "I never thought this day would come," she said quietly. The admission hit me like a physical blow. Part of me had been hoping Jake was right, that there had been some kind of mistake or mix-up, but Mom's reaction confirmed what the test results had already told me. "So it's true," I said. "Dad really isn't my father." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "How long have you known?" "Since before you were born," she whispered. "Your father, Robert, he's known too. We've both known from the beginning." This was somehow worse than I'd imagined. Not only had my paternity been a lie, but it had been a conscious, deliberate deception that both of my parents had maintained for my entire life. "Who is my real father?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Mom closed her eyes. "Tom Kowalski." Hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way that seeing it on the DNA report hadn't. My hands started shaking again. "Tell me what happened," I said. "All of it. I deserve to know." Mom was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her deciding how much to reveal. Finally, she started talking, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your father and I were having problems in 1988, she said. We'd been married for 3 years,
But he was working all the time, and I felt like we were more like roommates than husband and wife. We were talking about separation. She paused, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. Tom and Helen had just moved in down the street. Tom was working construction then, and he helped us with some repairs around the house. He was everything Robert wasn't. Warm and funny and present, and I was lonely. I felt sick. You had an affair? It wasn't supposed to happen, she said quickly. It was just one time, one night when Robert was out of town on business, and I was feeling sorry for myself. Tom came over to fix a leaky faucet, and we started talking, and she trailed off, unable to finish. And 9 months later, I was born. She nodded miserably. By the time I realized I was pregnant, Tom and I had agreed it was a mistake that could never happen again. He loved Helen, and despite our problems, I loved Robert. We decided to pretend it never happened. But Dad knew? I told him before you were born, she said. I couldn't live with that secret, especially not with a baby coming. I expected him to leave me, but he said he wanted to raise you as his own. He said it didn't matter whose DNA you had, that you would be his daughter in every way that counted. I tried to process this information, but it felt too big and complicated to fit in my head. And Mr. Kowalski? Does he know? Mom's face crumpled. He's suspected for years, especially as you got older and started looking more like him. But we've never talked about it directly. It was easier to just not acknowledge it. Easier for who? I asked, anger starting to creep into my voice. Because it certainly wasn't easier for me, growing up feeling like I didn't fit in my own family. Emma, please, Mom said. We thought we were protecting you. We thought if you never knew, it wouldn't matter. But it does matter, I said, standing up from the table. It matters because I've spent my whole life wondering why I felt different, why I connected better with the Kowalskis than with my own parents. It matters because the man I thought was my father has been emotionally distant my entire life, and now I understand why.
Robert loves you, Mom said desperately. He may not show it the way Tom does, but he loves you completely. Maybe, I said, but he's not my father, and you've all been lying to me about it for 26 years. I walked toward the door, needing to get out of the house before I said something I'd regret. Emma, wait, Mom called after me. What are you going to do? I turned back to look at her, this woman who had given birth to me, but who suddenly felt like a stranger. I don't know, I said honestly, but I'm done with secrets. Jake was waiting in the car when I stumbled out of my parents' house, and one look at my face told him everything he needed to know about how that conversation had gone. She confirmed it? He asked as I collapsed into the passenger seat. Worse than that, I said, my voice hollow. They've all known since before I was born. Robert, Mom, and apparently Mr. Kowalski has suspected for years. Everyone knew except me. Jake reached over and squeezed my hand. I'm so sorry, Em. What do you want to do now? I stared at my childhood home through the windshield, this house where I'd grown up believing I knew who I was and where I came from. The evening light was casting long shadows across the front yard, and everything looked exactly the same as it always had, but somehow completely different. I need to talk to Robert, I said finally. I can't process any of this until I understand his side of the story. Are you sure you're ready for that conversation tonight? Jake asked gently. You've had a lot of revelations in one day. He was right, but I also knew I wouldn't be able to sleep or eat or think about anything else until I had more answers. I need to know why he agreed to raise me. I need to know if he's resented me all these years, if that's why he's always been so distant. We drove to a coffee shop downtown to kill time until Dad got home from whatever errands had taken him out that afternoon. I couldn't manage more than a few sips of tea, but sitting in the familiar bustle of other people's normal Sunday evenings helped ground me a little. Jake didn't try to fill the silence with reassurances or advice, which I appreciated. He just sat with me while I tried to organize my thoughts for what would probably be the hardest conversation of my life. When we got back to the house around 8 o'clock, Dad's car was in the driveway. I could see him through the kitchen window, standing at the counter reading something that was probably work-related. The sight of him hit me differently than it ever had before. This man who had been my father in every practical sense, but who had never quite felt emotionally available, suddenly made sense in a completely different way. "Do you want me to come with you?" Jake offered. "I think I need to do this alone," I said. "But thank you for everything today. I know this wasn't how you pictured spending the day after our wedding." "Hey," he said, lifting my chin so I had to look at him. "We're married now. That means your family drama is my family drama. We'll figure this out together, okay?" I nodded, feeling grateful and overwhelmed and completely unmoored all at once. Dad looked up when I walked into the kitchen, and I saw the exact moment he registered that something was seriously wrong. "Emma, I thought you and Jake were flying to Italy tonight." "We canceled the trip," I said, sitting down at the table. "We need to talk about the DNA results." His face went pale, and he set down whatever he'd been reading. For a long moment, we just looked at each other across the kitchen, and I realized this was a conversation he'd been dreading for 26 years. "Your mother told you," he said finally. "It wasn't a question. She told me about the affair. She told me you've known since before I was born. What she didn't tell me was why you stayed. Why did you decide to raise another man's child?" Dad sat down across from me, suddenly looking older than his 54 years. He was quiet for so long that I started to wonder if he was going to answer at all. "Do you remember when you were 7 and you built that elaborate fort out of couch cushions and blankets?" The question caught me off guard. What does that have to do with anything? "You worked on it for hours," he continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "You had this whole architectural plan mapped out, with different rooms for different purposes. When your mother told you it was time to clean up for dinner, you started crying because you weren't finished." I did remember that, vaguely, but I still didn't understand where he was going with this. "I helped you reinforce the structure with some of my old engineering textbooks," Dad said, "and I told your mother we could eat dinner in the fort instead of at the table. You were so excited, Emma. You kept saying it was the best day ever, that I was the best dad ever." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and I felt my chest tighten.
"That was the moment I knew," he said. "Not when you were born, not during your first steps or first words, but that random Tuesday when you were 7 and building forts. That was when I understood that biology doesn't make someone your child. Love does. Choice does. Showing up every day does." I stared at him, this quiet man who had never been comfortable with emotional conversations, trying to reconcile this revelation with the distant father I thought I knew. "But you've always been so—" I struggled to find the right words. "You've never seemed to enjoy being my dad the way other fathers enjoy their kids." Dad was quiet again, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I was terrified of overstepping, of loving you too much when you weren't really mine. Your mother and I agreed that it would be easier if I maintained some emotional distance, just in case." "In case what?" "In case someday you found out the truth and decided you didn't want me as your father anymore." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. All those years I'd felt like he was holding back, like he didn't quite know how to connect with me. He'd been protecting himself from exactly this moment. "So you loved me less to make it hurt less if I left?" I asked. "I thought I was loving you less," he said, "but it turns out you can't really control that. I may not be your biological father, Emma, but you are absolutely my daughter. You always have been." I felt tears starting to form, and I didn't know if they were from sadness or relief or anger or all three combined. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I asked. "Why did you let me spend years feeling like I didn't fit in this family when you could have explained everything?" "Because I was selfish," he admitted. "Because I was afraid that if you knew Tom was your biological father, you'd want him to be your real father too, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing you." "You wouldn't have lost me," I said, though even as I said it, I wasn't entirely sure it was true. "But you might have had a daughter who understood why you seemed so uncomfortable around her." Dad flinched like I'd slapped him. "I know I wasn't the father you deserved, Emma.
I know I let my own fears and insecurities get in the way of giving you what you needed, but please don't doubt that I love you. Please don't doubt that raising you has been the greatest privilege of my life." We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 26 years of unspoken truths settling between us. I thought about all the times I'd wished he would show more interest in my projects, celebrate my achievements with more enthusiasm, or just seem more comfortable in his role as my father. Now I understood that his restraint hadn't been indifference, it had been fear. "I don't know how to process all of this," I said finally. "I don't know how to reconcile the father you are with the father I thought you were, or how to figure out what this means for my relationship with Mr. Kowalski." "Tom is a good man," Dad said quietly. "Whatever happens next, whatever you decide about your relationship with him, I want you to know that I don't blame him for what happened between him and your mother, and I don't regret the choice we made to raise you together. Even though it's been complicated?" "Especially because it's been complicated," he said. "The best things in life usually are." I looked at this man who had changed my diapers and helped with homework and taught me to drive and walked me down the aisle just 2 days ago, trying to see him clearly for the first time. He wasn't perfect, and his approach to fatherhood had left gaps that I'd spent years trying to fill elsewhere. But he had chosen me, deliberately and completely, when he could have walked away. "I need some time," I said, "to figure out what all of this means and how I want to move forward." "Of course," Dad said. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready." I stood up to leave, then turned back. "For what it's worth, you are my dad. Biology doesn't change that. But I wish you'd trusted me enough to tell me the truth a long time ago." "So do I," he said. "So do I." As I walked back to the car where Jake was waiting, I felt like I was carrying the weight of multiple lifetimes' worth of secrets and misunderstandings. I now knew why I'd always felt like an outsider in my own family, and why I'd connected so naturally with the Kowalskis. But knowing the truth hadn't made anything simpler. If anything, it had made everything infinitely more complicated. Because now I had to figure out what to do about the man who was actually my biological father, who had been watching me grow up from 3 houses away, who had danced with me at my wedding while carrying this enormous secret. I had to decide whether to confront Tom Kowalski with what I now knew, and what that conversation might mean for both of our families. The drive back to our hotel was quiet. Both Jake and I lost in our own thoughts about how dramatically our lives had changed in the span of a single day. 24 hours ago, I'd been a newlywed heading off on her honeymoon. Now, I was a woman whose entire understanding of her family had been turned inside out, facing decisions I never could have imagined having to make. I spent most of Monday staring at the ceiling of our hotel room, trying to work up the courage to call Tom Kowalski. Jake had gone out to get us coffee and breakfast, giving me space to think, but thinking was the last thing I actually wanted to do. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Tom's face at the wedding reception, the way he'd looked at me during our dance, the strange weight in his voice when he'd said I'd always be special to their family. Had he been trying to tell me something? Had he been waiting all these years for me to figure it out on my own? When Jake returned with bagels and caffeine, I was sitting cross-legged on the bed with my phone in my hands, Tom's contact information pulled up on the screen. "Any decision on what you want to do today?" Jake asked carefully, settling beside me with his own coffee. "I keep starting to call him, then chickening out," I admitted. "How do you even begin a conversation like that? Hey, Tom, so I found out you're my biological father. Want to grab lunch and discuss?" "Maybe don't lead with that," Jake suggested, which actually made me smile for the first time since Sunday morning. "The thing is, I don't even know what I want from this conversation," I said. "Do I want him to confirm what I already know? Do I want an apology? Do I want him to explain why he never said anything? I have no idea what outcome I'm hoping for." Jake reached over and took my free hand. Maybe the point isn't to have a specific outcome in mind. Maybe it's just to get the conversation started and see where it goes. He was right, but that didn't make the prospect any less terrifying. I'd spent my entire life with Tom Kowalski as the safe, comfortable presence, the understanding adult who always had time for my questions, who celebrated my successes without reservation, who made me feel seen in a way my own parents never quite managed. Now I had to reconcile that relationship with the knowledge that he was actually my father, and that our entire dynamic had been built on a foundation of unspoken truth. What if this ruins everything? I asked. What if bringing it out in the open changes our relationship in ways I don't want it to change? What if not bringing it out in the open means you spend the rest of your life wondering what could have been different? Jake countered. I knew he was right, but that didn't make the phone call any easier. Finally, around noon, I decided to stop overthinking and just dial the number before I could talk myself out of it again. Tom answered on the second ring, his familiar voice warm and cheerful. Emma, how's the honeymoon? Are you calling from some beautiful Italian piazza? Actually, we're still in Phoenix, I said, my voice coming out more strained than I'd intended. Tom, I need to talk to you about something. Are you free this afternoon? There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted. Of course. Is everything okay? I'd rather discuss it in person if that's all right. Could we meet somewhere private? Why don't you come by the house? He suggested. Helen's at her book club until 5, so we'd have some quiet time to talk. The idea of having this conversation in the Kowalski house, surrounded by 2 decades worth of memories, felt both appropriate and overwhelming, but I agreed, and we settled on 2 o'clock. Jake offered to come with me, but I knew this was something I needed to do alone. The drive to the Kowalskis felt surreal. I'd made this trip thousands of times over the years, but never with the knowledge I was carrying now. When I pulled into their driveway, Tom was already waiting on the front porch, and something about his posture told me he had a pretty good idea what this conversation was going to be about. Come on in, kiddo, he said, though his usual easy smile seemed forced. Can I get you something to drink? I'm okay, I said, following him into the living room where Madison and I had spent countless afternoons doing homework and watching movies. Everything looked exactly the same comfortable couch, the same family photos on the mantel, the same sense of warmth and belonging that had drawn me here so often over the years. We sat down across from each other, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Tom was studying my face with an expression I'd seen before but never understood, a mixture of love and longing, and something that looked almost like grief. The DNA results came back, I said finally, deciding to just jump straight to the point. Tom's shoulders sagged slightly, and he nodded. I figured that's what this was about. When you called and said you needed to talk privately. You know, don't you? I asked. You've known all along. I've suspected since you were about 10 years old, he admitted. You started looking so much like my side of the family, and your personality. Emma, you have my mother's laugh. You have her way of tilting your head when you're thinking hard about something. I couldn't ignore the similarities forever. But you never said anything.
What was I supposed to say? Tom asked, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Your parents were raising you, and they were doing a good job. You seemed happy and healthy and loved. What right did I have to disrupt that? The right of being my actual father, I said, more sharply than I'd intended. Tom flinched, and I immediately felt guilty for the harshness in my voice. I'm sorry, I said. I don't mean to take this out on you. I'm just trying to understand how everyone could keep this secret for so long. Do you want to know what really happened? Tom asked quietly. The whole story? Not just your mother's version? I nodded, bracing myself for whatever revelations were coming next. Tom was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. Your mother was right about one thing. It only happened once. Helen and I had been trying to have kids for 2 years with no luck, and it was putting strain on our marriage. Patricia was lonely because Robert worked all the time. We were both in vulnerable places. He paused, running his hands through his graying hair. It was never supposed to be anything more than two friends comforting each other. But afterward, we both realized how dangerous the situation was becoming. We agreed to pretend it never happened, and we did a pretty good job of that until you were born. When did you know for sure that I was yours? The moment I saw you? Simply. You had my eyes, my chin, even the same cowlick I had as a baby. But by then, Patricia and Robert had made their decision about how they wanted to handle things, and I had to respect that. Even though it meant watching your daughter grow up thinking someone else was her father? Tom's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in my life, I saw this strong, steady man who had been my anchor completely break down. Emma, do you have any idea how hard it's been? Watching you take your first steps in their backyard instead of mine? Celebrating your achievements from a distance when all I wanted was to tell everyone how proud I was of my daughter. Seeing you struggle with feeling different from your parents when I could have explained why, but knowing it wasn't my place? I felt my own tears starting, overwhelmed by the pain in his voice. There were so many times I almost told you, when you got accepted to college, when you brought Jake home to meet us, when I danced with you at your wedding. I kept thinking maybe it was time, maybe you deserved to know the truth. But then I'd remember that I'd already caused enough disruption in your family, and I'd convinced myself to stay quiet. Tom, I said softly, and hearing me use his first name instead of Mr. K seemed to surprise both of us. I need you to understand something. All those years I felt like I didn't quite fit with my parents. You were the person who made me feel like I belonged somewhere. You were the one who saw me clearly, who encouraged my dreams, who made me feel valued and understood. Because you're my daughter, he said simply. Of course I saw you clearly. Of course I believed in you. You're the best thing I've ever had a hand in creating. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us crying quietly. Finally, I asked the question that had been weighing on me since Sunday morning. What happens now? How do we move forward with this knowledge? Tom wiped his eyes and looked at me with an expression that was pure love and acceptance. That's entirely up to you, Emma. I've spent 26 years respecting other people's decisions about my role in your life. This time, I think the choice should be yours. I don't know what I want. I don't know how to be your daughter when I've been someone else's daughter my whole life. I don't know how this affects my relationship with Robert, or with Helen, or with Madison. I don't even know if I should tell Madison. Madison doesn't know, Tom confirmed, though I suspect Helen might have figured it out years ago. She's never said anything directly, but sometimes I catch her watching you with this knowing look. The idea that Helen might have known, that she'd welcomed me into their home and treated me like family while carrying the secret, added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. I need time, I said finally, to process all of this, to figure out what it means and how I want to handle it. Take all the time you need, Tom said. I've spent 26 years waiting to have this conversation. I can wait however long it takes for you to decide what comes next. As I got up to leave, Tom stood too, and for a moment we just looked at each other. Father and daughter finally acknowledging what we'd always known but never spoken. For what it's worth, Tom said as I reached the door, you turned out exactly the way I always hoped you would. Strong, kind, intelligent, talented. Even if I couldn't take credit for raising you, I've never stopped being proud that you're mine. I hugged him then. Really hugged him, in a way I'd never allowed myself to before. And for the first time in my life, I understood why I'd always felt so at home in his arms.
The weeks following my conversation with Tom felt like living in an alternate reality. Jake and I had rescheduled our honeymoon for December, which gave me time to process everything without the pressure of pretending to be a carefree newlywed in Tuscany. But processing turned out to be more complicated than I'd anticipated. I found myself analyzing every interaction I'd ever had with both families through this new lens. Every birthday party, every holiday dinner, every casual neighborhood barbecue suddenly carried weight I'd never noticed before. I started remembering moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt loaded with meaning. Like the Christmas when I was 12 and Tom had given me a professional-grade drafting set for when you become a famous architect. At the time, I'd been touched that he believed in my dreams so specifically. Now I understood that he'd been investing in his daughter's future in the only way he was allowed to. Or the evening when I was 16 and came home crying because a boy at school had broken up with me in front of his friends. Robert had offered awkward but well-meaning advice about focusing on my studies instead of boys, but Tom, who'd been fixing their sprinkler system when I'd walked through their yard, had taken one look at my face and spent an hour teaching me how to throw a perfect spiral with a football, letting me work out my anger and frustration without having to talk about it at all. "You're overthinking this," Madison told me when I called her Thursday evening, 3 days after my conversation with her father. She was living in Denver now, working as a graphic designer, and I hadn't seen her since the wedding. "Am I?" I asked, pacing around our apartment while Jake cooked dinner. "Because it feels like my entire childhood was built on lies, and I'm just now figuring out what was real and what wasn't." "Emma, you're being dramatic," Madison said, though her tone was gentle. "Your childhood was real. The love was real. The only thing that wasn't real was who you thought your biological father was, and honestly, does that change anything about the actual experiences you had?" She had a point, but it didn't make the emotional upheaval any easier to navigate. "Have you talked to your parents since Sunday?" she asked. "I've texted with Mom a few times," I said. "Short messages, just letting her know I'm okay and need space. I haven't talked to Robert since Monday night." "And my dad?" I hesitated. Madison still didn't know what I'd discovered, and I wasn't sure how to bring it up. Tom had said the decision about telling her was mine, but I had no idea how she'd react to finding out we were actually half-sisters. "I saw him Monday," I said. "We had a good conversation." "Good," Madison said. "He's been worried about you. Mom, too. They keep asking if I've heard from you." The fact that Helen was concerned about me, potentially knowing what she knew, made my chest tight with emotion I couldn't quite name. "Madison," I said, sitting down on our couch, "can I ask you something? Did you ever think it was weird how much your dad cared about me? Like, more than a normal neighbor would?" "Are you kidding?" Madison laughed. "Dad has basically treated you like a second daughter since we were kids. If anything, I was jealous sometimes of how much attention he paid to your projects and achievements." "You were jealous?" "Not in a bad way," she clarified quickly. "But yeah, sometimes I felt like he was more interested in your soccer games than mine, or your college applications than mine. Mom used to tease him about having a favorite honorary daughter." I felt sick. All these years, Madison had been competing for her father's attention with someone who was actually his biological child, and none of us had known it. "Madison, I have to tell you something," I said, the words coming out before I could second-guess myself. I explained everything, the DNA test, the conversations with my parents, the revelation about Tom being my biological father. Madison was quiet for so long that I started to worry the call had dropped. "Madison, are you still there?" "I'm here," she said finally, her voice strange. I'm trying to process this. You're saying that you're actually my half-sister?" "Biologically, yes." Another long pause. "Emma, this is insane. How are you handling this? How is everyone handling this?" "Not well," I admitted. "I feel like I don't know who I am anymore, or how I'm supposed to relate to anyone in either family." "But Emma," Madison said, and I could hear excitement creeping into her voice, "don't you see what this means? We really are sisters. All those years we joked about being sisters from different families, and it turns out we actually are family." Her reaction caught me completely off guard. I'd been so focused on the betrayal and confusion that I hadn't considered the positive aspects of what I'd learned. "You're not angry?" I asked. "That your father had an affair? That he's been keeping this secret your whole life?" "I mean, I'm shocked," Madison said, "and I definitely want to have some conversations with Mom and Dad about why they never told me. But angry? Emma, you've been the sister I never had since we were 6 years old. Finding out it's actually true feels like the universe is finally making sense." Her perspective was so different from mine that it made me step back and reconsider everything I'd been feeling. Maybe I'd been so caught up in feeling betrayed that I'd missed the gift hidden inside this revelation. "I'm flying home this weekend," Madison continued. "I need to talk to Mom and Dad, and I want to be there for you while you figure out what comes next." After we hung up, I sat on the couch staring at my phone, feeling lighter than I had since Sunday morning. Jake emerged from the kitchen with 2 plates of pasta and settled beside me. "How'd that go?" he asked. "Better than expected," I said. "She's excited about actually being my sister. I hadn't even considered that angle." "Maybe that's because you've been focused on what you've lost instead of what you've gained," Jake suggested. He was right. I'd been so devastated by the lies and secrets that I'd missed the fact that I now understood why I'd always felt so connected to the Kowalski family. I finally had an explanation for the sense of belonging I'd never quite felt with my own parents. And I had a biological father who had spent decades loving me from a distance, waiting for the chance to be more present in my life. That weekend, when Madison came home, the 4 of us, Madison, Tom, Helen, and I, sat around their kitchen table and had the most honest conversation any of us had ever shared. Helen confirmed that she'd suspected for years, but had chosen to trust Tom when he said nothing had happened between him and my mother. "I knew something was different about the way he looked at you," Helen said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "But I also saw how much he loved our family, and I knew he would never do anything to hurt us deliberately. When I started suspecting the truth, I decided that loving you like my own daughter was more important than demanding explanations." "You could have hated me," I said. "You could have banned me from your house." "Emma," Helen said firmly, "you were a child. Whatever happened between the adults was never your fault, and you deserved to be loved unconditionally. If anything, watching Tom struggle with not being able to claim you publicly made me love him more, not less." Madison, meanwhile, was practically vibrating with excitement about our newfound sisterhood. She kept saying things like, "I knew there was a reason we were so close, and this explains why we have the same sense of humor." But it was Tom who surprised me the most. For the first time since I'd known him, he seemed completely relaxed around me. The careful distance he'd always maintained, which I'd never consciously noticed before, was gone. He told stories about his own childhood, asked detailed questions about my work, and made plans for projects we could tackle together in his workshop. "It feels like I can finally breathe," he told me as we walked around their backyard after dinner. 26 years of holding back, of being careful not to overstep, of pretending I didn't love you the way I really did. I didn't realize how exhausting it was until it stopped. "I'm still figuring out what this means for my relationship with Robert," I admitted. "He's been my dad my whole life, and I don't want to hurt him. But I also don't want to keep pretending that our relationship has been everything it could have been." "You don't have to choose," Tom said. "Robert raised you, and he deserves credit for that. But that doesn't mean there isn't room in your life for both of us." "Is that what you want?" I asked. "To be my father now after all these years?" Tom stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression serious. "Emma, I've wanted to be your father since the day you were born. But I want it on your terms, at your pace, in whatever way feels right to you. I'm not trying to replace Robert or disrupt your life. I just want the chance to love you openly instead of from the shadows." Looking at him, really looking at him, I could see so many similarities I'd never noticed before. The way he tilted his head when he was thinking, the same gesture Madison had pointed out in myself, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, exactly like mine did, the way he used his hands when he talked, which I'd always done too. "I'd like that," I said. "I'd like to try being your daughter." The relief on his face was so profound that it made me realize how much courage it had taken for him to respect my family's boundaries all these years, and how much it must have cost him to stay silent. That night, as Jake and I drove back to our apartment, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the wedding: peace. Not complete resolution. There were still conversations to be had with Robert, relationships to rebuild, and new dynamics to navigate. But for the first time in a week, I felt like I understood who I was and where I belonged. "You seem different," Jake observed as we got ready for bed. calmer. I think I'm starting to see this as something I gained instead of something that was taken from me, I said. I have two fathers who love me, even if they've shown it in different ways. I have a sister I've always felt connected to, and now I know why. I have answers to questions I didn't even know I was asking.
And? Jake prompted, sensing there was more. And I think I'm ready to start building something new with all these relationships instead of mourning the version I thought I had. The hardest conversation was still ahead of me. 2 weeks after my talk with Tom and the family meeting at the Kowalskis, I finally worked up the courage to have a real heart-to-heart with Robert. Not the careful, surface-level discussion we'd had the night I discovered the truth, but the deeper conversation about what our relationship would look like moving forward. I asked him to meet me at Papago Park, where he'd taught me to ride a bike when I was 6. It seemed fitting to have this discussion somewhere that held good memories of us together, somewhere that reminded both of us that our relationship had a real foundation despite its complicated beginning. Robert was already waiting when I arrived, sitting on the same bench where we used to rest during our weekend bike rides. He looked nervous, which was unusual for him. In all my years of knowing this quiet, controlled man, I'd rarely seen him appear genuinely anxious. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," I said, sitting down beside him. "I know this hasn't been an easy couple of weeks for anyone." "How are you doing?" he asked, studying my face. "You look better than you did 2 weeks ago." "I feel better," I admitted. "I've had some good conversations with Tom and his family, and I think I'm starting to understand everyone's perspective better." Robert nodded, though I caught a flicker of something, maybe pain, maybe fear, cross his expression when I mentioned Tom. "Robert," I said, turning to face him more directly, "I need you to know that learning the truth about my parentage doesn't change the fact that you're my dad. You raised me. You were there for every scraped knee, every school play, every teenage crisis. Biology doesn't erase 26 years of that." His shoulders relaxed slightly, but he still looked uncertain. "But I also need you to understand that I can't pretend Tom doesn't exist, or that I don't want to explore what having a relationship with my biological father might look like." "I know," he said quietly. "I've always known this day might come. The thing is, I don't think it has to be an either-or situation. I don't think loving Tom as my biological father means loving you less as the man who raised me, but I need to know that you can handle me having both relationships." Robert was quiet for a long time, staring out at the red rock formations in the distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but emotional. "Emma, for 26 years, I've been afraid that if you ever found out the truth, I'd lose you. That fear shaped everything about how I approached being your father, probably not in good ways. I held back when I should have been more present. I stayed distant when I should have been warm, all because I was terrified of caring too much about someone who might decide she didn't want me as her father." He turned to look at me, and I saw tears in his eyes. "But watching you these past 2 weeks, seeing how you've handled this revelation with such grace and maturity, I realized that my fears were about me, not about you. You're not the kind of person who throws away relationships that matter just because something better comes along. You're the kind of person who finds room in her heart for everyone who deserves to be there. I learned that from you. Maybe not from your words, but from your actions. You made room in your heart for a child who wasn't biologically yours. You taught me that love is a choice, not just a feeling." "I want you to have a relationship with Tom," Robert said, and I could tell the words were difficult for him. "I want you to explore what that connection means, and I want you to do it without worrying about my feelings. Tom is a good man, and he's your father in ways that I could never be. That doesn't diminish what we have. It just means you're lucky enough to have 2 fathers who love you." I felt tears starting and reached over to hug him. "I love you, Dad. Nothing that happens with Tom will ever change that." "I love you too, sweetheart," he said, hugging me back tighter than he had in years. "And I'm proud of the woman you've become. Both Tom and I had a hand in that, in different ways."
Over the following months, I slowly navigated the complex process of building a new relationship with Tom while maintaining and strengthening my connection with Robert. It wasn't always easy. There were awkward moments, jealous feelings on all sides, and logistical challenges around holidays and family events that had never existed before. But there were also unexpected joys. Tom started teaching me advanced woodworking in his garage, and I discovered I had inherited his natural ability with tools and spatial reasoning. Robert and I began having regular coffee dates, where we talked about work and life without the careful emotional distance that had always characterized our relationship before.
This is weird but wonderful, Madison whispered to me as we cleared dishes after dinner. Like, objectively, this situation should be incredibly awkward, but somehow it just feels right. She was right. Watching Robert and Helen compare notes on my childhood achievements, seeing Tom and my mother have their first real conversation in 27 years, observing Jake navigate relationships with his new extended family, it all felt natural in a way I never could have predicted. During dessert, Tom stood up and tapped his wine glass for attention. "I want to say something," he said, looking around the table. 6 months ago, we were all keeping secrets that we thought were protecting the people we loved. But what we've learned is that love doesn't need protection from truth. It needs truth to grow stronger. He looked directly at me. "Emma, you've taught all of us that family isn't just about who shares your DNA or who raised you from birth. It's about who shows up, who chooses to love you, and who commits to being part of your story. You've made room in your life for all of us, even when it would have been easier to walk away from the complications." "To Emma," Robert added, raising his glass, "who taught us that families can be bigger and more complex and more loving than we ever imagined." As everyone toasted, I looked around at this unlikely gathering of people who had all played crucial roles in making me who I was. My mother, who had made difficult choices and carried heavy secrets to protect her family. Robert, who had loved me as his own despite his fears and insecurities. Tom, who had spent decades loving me from a respectful distance. Helen, who had welcomed me with open arms even when she suspected the complicated truth. Madison, who had gained a sister and couldn't be happier about it. And Jake, who had taken all of this family drama in stride and helped me navigate it with patience and wisdom. 6 months earlier, I thought I knew exactly who I was and where I came from. The DNA test results had shattered that certainty and forced me to rebuild my understanding of my family and my identity from the ground up. But what I'd discovered in the rebuilding process was that I hadn't lost anything essential. I'd gained depth, complexity, and a richer understanding of what it means to be loved. Today, when people ask about my family, I tell them I have 2 fathers, one who raised me and one who gave me life, both of whom shaped who I became. I tell them I have a sister I've known my whole life but only recently claimed. I tell them that family is both simpler and more complicated than most people realize, and that the best families are the ones that choose each other every day. The DNA test that arrived the morning after my wedding didn't just reveal the truth about my parentage, it revealed the truth about love itself. That it's big enough to encompass contradictions, strong enough to survive secrets, and flexible enough to grow into whatever shape it needs to take. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it's patient enough to wait 26 years for the right moment to finally, fully bloom. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.